told me the lights would go, and that was my cue, but some of them have remained.
Most of those guys back there with the camera.
Yeah. So, Noam Chomsky, thanks for coming along here to Chatham House. We've got just about an hour.
Okay.
And Noam Chomsky has some stuff that he has to do later on. We're incredibly grateful to you for finding this little space. And the conceit is that we have a conversation. Now, I think we should perhaps talk about American foreign policy and not just gossip, though it does allow that.
That's what they announced. So we might as well talk about it.
But I'm hoping we can move fairly briskly into a question and answer session, so we maximize our time. This requires a degree of restraint on the part of us all, not least myself. You will not even be told my name, much less my record, in a boring, cherished kind of way. It requires restraint on your part, and you will forgive me in advance if I stop you.
No, it's fine.
In order to move things along.
Yeah.
A family man.
My children had a line that they used. If they asked a question, as kids do, they'd sometimes say, "Just the 5-minute lecture, please."
And over time it was 4, then 3, then 2.
Yeah.
And it'll require discipline on your parts as well, please. And I might be quite tough on that. No speeches. I'll repeat that, later on. Say who you are if you feel you can. The more concise the questions, the more enjoyable the event is for us all. And I have here, we do say, tweet questions. And since we say this, we should nod in the direction of Twitter. I have a Twitter guru. Where is my Twitter guru? Where is my expert? She's lurking close to the exit. Stephanie will be asked perhaps to produce a Twitter tweet. And also, you guys can tweet. So as we are proceeding, if there's something that strikes you want to say, all you have to do is tweet, if you do tweet, and all you have to do is #AskCH. But people who are outside the hall, people who are not here, can do it as well. So it's a nice way of broadening the audience. Noam, I guess crudely, the Snowden stuff. A surprise, and I mean by that, a surprise at quite how extraordinary it was, or not a surprise at all?
I think the scale was, at least to me, very surprising. It is, in fact, phenomenal. Actually, there's a new book by Glenn Greenwald, I don't know if it's come out here, which surveys a lot of it, brings it together, and it's really a colossal campaign. It's very clear that they want to pick up everything. Everything that anyone says, who they meet, who they see, anything you can think of. It's 100%. The goal is 100% collection of all information about all of the enemies of the state. And what this reveals pretty dramatically is something we all ought to know, that for states, one of their main enemies is the domestic population. They have to be kept under control. They're dangerous. And if you look at policy decisions, it's pretty consistent that you have to control this dangerous enemy. This carries it way beyond anything that's been done before. Of course, there's been plenty before. I was, during the 1960s, I was very much involved in resistance activities against the war in Vietnam. And we understood that you can't talk on the telephone. And if there's anything serious, something that would involve particular human beings, let's say a deserter or something, you couldn't even talk in a group of friends, because there's probably a government informer there. So everything had to be done with affinity groups. So this is well understood and goes way back, but nothing like this scale has ever happened. And Britain agrees. As you probably saw, the British government requested the NSA to provide detailed, extensive information on cell phones, social media, other forms of interaction for British citizens who are an enemy of this state. In the United States, it's kind of dramatic because of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, part of the Bill of Rights, guarantees the security of citizens in their persons, homes, papers, and effects, and bars what are called unreasonable search and seizures. There's a reason for that. It has to do with England. The British rulers demanded the right to break into homes, to search them. And there were pretty bitter confrontations right in Boston, where I live. In fact, the citizens organizing to bar the entry of British officers under what were called writs of assistance, that they could just enter wherever they liked. This was one of the things that sparked the American Revolution. And shortly afterwards, when the Bill of Rights was introduced into the Constitution, they made sure to put a barrier against any such practices on the part of the state. Well, now the Fourth Amendment is being violated in a way which is so dramatic that it takes your colleagues in the legal profession to try to figure out how to make them consistent.
But then they can always find a professor who can do the other work.
That's the role of lawyers. So yes,
well, I wouldn't go that far. But
they'll find a way to say that knowing everything that you do is a reasonable search and seizure.
When you compare the response to Watergate, which, when you look at what's happening today, seems small beer, and yet it brought down a president. Now, maybe it was a cover-up, maybe it wasn't, but has the culture in America changed markedly in what is now 50 years since that time?
Well, I have to tell you that I was a minority of maybe one in thinking that Watergate was a kind of a tea party. Actually, I was asked to write about Watergate right away by the New York Review, and I agreed, but I said I would write only if I could explain that it didn't amount to anything. In fact, it was pretty striking. The Watergate exposures came out at the very same time as the exposures of COINTELPRO. Same time. COINTELPRO was a massive government criminal operation directed against the population that went through 4 administrations, mainly Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon, started a little earlier. And it targeted virtually all critical thought and action for not only surveillance, but for disruption. It went way beyond the Snowden case. It went as far as literal political assassination. In fact, right at the time of Watergate, there was an exposure of the fact that in 1969, in one of the COINTELPRO operations, this is an FBI operation. FBI is the National Political Police. So they were trying to destroy the black movements, and they really decimated them. Mostly the worst case, which had just appeared at the time of Watergate, was the assassination of Fred Hampton. Mm-hmm. Fred Hampton was a Black Panther, an organizer, a very successful organizer, no criminal charges, nothing like that. He was organizing in the Chicago ghettos. The FBI, under COINTELPRO, wanted to assassinate him. They tried at first to incite a criminal gang in the ghetto, the Rangers, Blackstone Rangers, to kill him. They sent false letters to the heads of the Rangers written in kind of fake black dialect, which they decoded instantly. The FBI is not very smart, to try to tell them that, that Fred Hampton was going to go after them, so they'd react, but they didn't.
Can I come in on this, though?
And then
go on.
Pardon?
Yeah, go on. I want to ask you a general question about this, if you finish.
What happened is that the FBI had implanted an informer who was Hampton's bodyguard, and they gave false information to the Chicago police about guns in the apartment. 4 a.m., the police broke in, really a Gestapo-style raid, and just murdered him in his bed. That act alone just swamps all of the Watergate exposures. And interestingly, it was barely reported. And that's only one. I mean, they went a lot of other things under COINTELPRO, which was far more serious than Watergate, and I think more serious than the NSA.
Is this, in its modern form, the use of drones to kill people abroad?
Pardon?
So I wonder, the drones, is that a modern equivalent?
The drone?
And I want to ask a sub-question about that, which is the nature of American public opinion. You paint just now, and you do in your writings, a picture of a kind of a really easily led amorphous community, which can be misled by this and led by that and so on. I mean,
well, take, say, COINTELPRO. I mean, it's hard to say that people were misled. They didn't know about it. Yeah. There is something called journalism, which is supposed to have the task of presenting to the public things that are significant and important for them to play a role in a democratic society. But that role is sometimes fulfilled, I wouldn't say zero, but to a very limited extent. In the case of COINTELPRO, there was virtually no coverage. The Hampton assassination, people couldn't protest because they didn't know about it.
What?
Take drones.
Yeah, take drones.
The drone campaign is a global terrorism campaign run by the Obama administration, which has absolutely no counterpart. There used to be some notion, lawyers will remember, there's this old thing called the Magna Carta, which we'll be commemorating in its death in next year, 800 years.
800 years. Don't add Sir Robert Worcester here.
Yeah.
He'll be very
But it established this, in a narrow form, but it established the notion of presumption of innocence. Pretty narrow, but then it was extended over the years. Well, that's been torn to shreds. By now, guilty means that Obama decided on Tuesday morning to kill you. That's the definition of guilty. Tuesday morning, there are these sessions in the White House where they read a little St. Augustine on just wars and then decide who we're going to murder today. And they're recognized to be suspects. And it's massive. You know, it's all over large parts of the world.
And they can be American, as they have been.
Well, it's interesting. There are a few cases, I think 4, where American citizens were killed. Now, that has caused a lot of debate and discussion, which is curious. The tacit assumption is that if you want to kill non-Americans, it's free. Do it. Do whatever you like. But murdering American citizens, well, you know, raises some constitutional questions. So that's debated. But I mean, suppose, say, that Iran, let's say, had the capacity to murder people in the United States and Israel who they regard as a threat. I mean, they have good reason to regard them as a threat, like leading figures and top leaders in the United States and Israel are regularly saying that all options are open, which means if we want to carry out a nuclear attack against you, we'll do it. John McCain, during the last campaign, when he ran, his line was just bomb, bomb, bomb. Don't wait, let's bomb them. So there are plenty of people who they could regard as a threat. Suppose they decided to assassinate them. Would we sit here quietly and say, well, it's fine, they're not Iranian citizens, so why shouldn't they assassinate them? But when we do it, it's considered legitimate. And it's pretty striking that the U.S. government recognizes 2 things that are important. One is they're not only killing suspects, they're generating terrorists. They know very well that these campaigns are generating terrorists. When you start murdering people in tribal societies, which have a culture of defense and revenge, they respond. Take, say, 9/11. Turns out that 11 of the 19 apprehended hijackers were from a tribe in Yemen that had been bitterly repressed and attacked, first by the center and then by the international supporters of it, and they were taking revenge. There's a very important book on this by Akbar Ahmed, who's a Pakistani anthropologist, teaches in the United States, who's one of the leading experts on tribal societies. And he just calls it a war against tribal Islam and tribal societies generally, which react. The other thing is that that it is really massive terrorism, large-scale terrorism, and the fact that we accept it is pretty remarkable, and the acceptance is limited. The former head of the CIA, Michael Hayden, pointed out recently that there isn't a single government in the world which accepts Washington's legal basis for the drone campaign, he said, with two exceptions, Israel and Afghanistan. And I suspect he's wrong about Afghanistan. That's the support. So you generate terrorists, you kill whoever you like, and there's no support for it. But it continues.
What about the argument that, we're going to alienate a few guys, but we take out the leaders, we take out, to use that sort of military image. Yeah. And secondly, you may call it terrorism, but it's our terrorism. The famous Clash of Civilization stuff that was copyrighted in the American think tanks and books about lesser evils and so on. In a way, we have democracy, we have the rule of law, we're the good guys at this. You have absolutely contempt for that. But I wonder whether there isn't at its core some basic truth that the fact that these societies are different.
Sure, we're much more violent and aggressive. And in fact, when this happens in a more or less democratic society, citizens are much more culpable than when it's done in an authoritarian state. Like, say, suppose Iran was murdering people who were threatening it in the United States and Israel and probably Britain. Well, Iranian citizens couldn't do very much about that. It's a harsh authoritarian state. It's different here. We're pretty free. And if we accept it and tolerate it, that is morally very culpable. You may recall, I hope you've read Orwell's introduction to Animal Farm. As you probably know, it was not published, found 30 years later in his unpublished papers. But it's interesting. In it, he addresses himself to the people of England, free England. And he says, you shouldn't feel too self-righteous about this satirical denunciation of the totalitarian enemy. Because in England, actually I'm quoting now, he said, in England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And one of the mechanisms that he mentions is a good education. If you've gone to the best schools, LSE and so on.
Thank you for that plug. A rather ambivalent plug.
Then you have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say. And I think we can add, it wouldn't do to think. That's a significant element in free societies and carries with it severe moral responsibility, much more so than people who suffer in authoritarian or totalitarian states. I think that's something we pay much too little attention to.
Does it mean you end up watching, we'll say, something like the Russian taking of the Crimea, what's going on in Syria, possibly people might say China and Tibet? You end up a kind of spectator because you've taken away the power to intervene. Is that a logical position that you go to?
Well, take Crimea. It's an interesting case. The Russian takeover of Crimea is undoubtedly a criminal act. It violates the UN Charter. It violates specific treaties in which Russia agreed with others to observe the boundaries of Ukraine. So it's a criminal act. Is it the only such act in the world? For example, how much have you read about a much more severe case, the U.S. takeover of southeastern Cuba 110 years ago? The U.S. took over southeastern Cuba at the point of a gun. In fact, technically, there was a treaty, but under military occupation. You know what that means. There was a treaty in which it's what we call Guantanamo. It includes Cuba's major port. The U.S. has absolutely no claim to it. Whatever one thinks about Crimea, there is a claim. Popular support, history, Khrushchev's handing over of Crimea to Ukraine without even asking the population. A referendum in 1991, which came out with about the same results as the recent one, the major Russian warm water port, naval base. I mean, there's considerations. In the case of the U.S. takeover of southeastern Cuba, there is nothing since Cuban independence in 1959. The Cuban government's been trying to get it back. The U.S., of course, refuses. The only justification is that this severely hampers the economic development of Cuba. For 50 years, the United States has been engaged in a significant war against Cuba. Under Kennedy, it was a large-scale terrorist campaign. We don't talk about it here, but it was a very serious terrorist campaign which continued, crushing embargo, taking over the southeastern Cuba, of course, severely hampers Cuban development. That's the point. But this is much worse than the Russians, though their actions are criminal, have a much stronger case. How much have you read in the press about this? And it's not the only case.
I totally take that one. But I met the guy the China guy, who is the equivalent of our press guy, Alistair Campbell it used to be. And they used to publish this report about how dreadful America was. All the people who died, who were killed, the rapes, the race killings. And whenever you raised human rights with them, they'd say, with respect, kind of what you said, you know, America, look at all the violence, look at Rodney King. Is it sort of always an appropriate response? Because it seems to me all that happens is you just say, oh, what Russia does is bad, what China does is bad, but my goodness, look what America does. I mean, it seems to be a kind of dodge of the criticism, is it?
I don't see why it's a dodge. We accept that principle uniformly with regard to enemy states. So, for example, if Shirin Ebadi criticizes Iran but doesn't criticize Israel, or if Ai Weiwei criticizes China but doesn't denounce the United States, or Sakharov, Havel, anyone, we admire them for that. That's what they should be doing. They should be concentrating on the crimes of their own countries. And for us, that's even more significant for the reason I mentioned. We can influence these policies. Ai Weiwei can't do much about the policies of China. We admire him for condemning them. We don't want him, nobody wants him to write about the U.S. and British crimes. It's a waste of his time. He should be doing exactly what he's doing. And we have a far greater responsibility to do it because we are responsible for these policies in a way which dissidents in harsh states are not, and we can influence them. But it's pretty striking that we recognize this principle reflexively with regard to enemy states, and we can't see it with regard to ourselves, where it's much more significant.
Yeah. If you take, say, that example of critiquing from the inside, Mersher and Walt made a huge splash with a book about the power of the Israeli lobby in the United States. In a way, it resembles what Piketty is doing at the moment with the book on capital. Do these books gain traction in American society? They are published in America, they're talked about in America, or do they disappear? What happens to dissent, strong dissent, within the American political tradition?
Well, the Piketty book has been well received, lots of comment on it, mostly by economists in the business press, and it's undoubtedly an important book, no reason why it shouldn't be. Mearsheimer Walt's a little bit different. For one thing, there's two questions, there's a number of questions to ask about the book, I'm sure. The one thing has to do with the quality of their claims. The other is about its reception. Notice that I think it is well received, and I think the reason is it exculpates the U.S. government. It says, look, we're fine, but what can we do? There's this powerful Jewish lobby that's controlling us. So we'd be delighted to be benevolent and, helping people, our natural instincts, but we're trapped by the Jewish lobby. Well, that's a pretty good reason, I think, why it is accepted. Yeah. The second question is about the thesis. I mean, can it really be that a small ethnic lobby controls U.S. policy? I mean, if anybody believes that thesis, there's a tactical suggestion that follows immediately. Put on your tie and jacket, go to the executive offices of Lockheed Martin, General Electric, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, and explain to them that your interests are being harmed by a little lobby which you can put out of business in 5 minutes. Okay, that's the tactical suggestion that follows. Does anybody pursue it? No, because it's absurd. I mean, the claim, this is actually is an interesting, Mearsheimer and Wald are very good scholars. They're what are called realist IR scholars. According to realist scholarship, states pursue what is called the national interest, which is primarily security. It's an anarchic world, and states try to preserve their own security, well-being of their own populations, and the national interest. There's a lot of questions that are open there. First of all, what is the national interest? I mean, is the national interest of the CEO of General Electric the same as the interest of the janitor who cleans his floors? No, their interests are quite different. So what's the national interest? Well, in practice, it turns out that the interests of state power and concentrated economic power. Take a look at the formation of policy. That's what it defends. Is the national interest in that sense harmed by U.S. policy towards Israel? Well, pretty hard to argue that. Certainly centers of American power don't think so. Like, take Lockheed Martin, which are the military lobby industry altogether, big lobby. They think it's great. I mean, when the United States gives Israel a couple of $2 billion to buy advanced armaments, that's a gift to Lockheed Martin. In fact, it's a double gift because it's what in the retail trade is called a teaser. It means that Saudi Arabia comes along and says, wait a minute, we want $60 billion worth of second-rate equipment, which we don't know how to operate. And so defense industry can sell it to them, So that's wonderful. Furthermore, Israel tests the high-tech equipment on live targets. You learn things from that. There are very close relations of intelligence, very close. If you took a look at, it goes way back. Actually, one of the interesting Snowden revelations is that Israel's the only country that gets raw data, not what's called minimized. And most data in the NSA is supposed to be kind of checked, so things that are really improper and illegal are thrown out. And that's the way it's given to the so-called Five Eyes, England, Australia, the close allies, not Israel. They get straight data, and the intelligence relations are extremely close. Military relations are so close that you may have seen one of the interesting WikiLeaks exposures was a list of super strategic sites that are so important that the United States has to defend them at all costs. There were not many of them. One of them was right outside Haifa, Rafael Military Industries. That's one of the super significant U.S. sites that has to be defended. It's a military industry, high-tech military. It's one of the places where they did a lot of the drone technology. Their relations with the Pentagon are so close that they actually moved their management offices to Washington, where the money is. You take a look at, say, U.S. investors, Warren Buffett, Intel. They're investing in Israel all over the place. Buffett recently spent, $1 billion or something to acquire some Israeli company and announced that Israel's the best place for U.S. investors outside the United States. Intel set up their biggest new factory for new generation chips in Israel. I mean, do these people think that their interest is being harmed by this relationship?
Can I come in there? Because we're going to have to go to the audience, grudgingly, on my part, in a minute. John Kerry rings you up tomorrow. He says, this two-state thing, it's failed, Noam. I'm fed up with you telling me what to do. I'll do whatever you tell me. and he's only got a minute. You know, the aides are circling. What's next? One state?
Well, I'm sorry to be a minority of one again, but I think that the entire discourse on this is highly misleading. The usual discussion, almost universal, on the part of Israeli authorities, Palestinians, international commentators, almost everything, is that there are two options, either two states, or if that's gone, one state. And in fact, a lot of Palestinians support that. They say, okay, let's have Israel, let's give them the keys. They take the whole place over, we'll run a civil rights struggle, kind of an anti-apartheid struggle. That's all pie in the sky. Those are not the two options. There are two options. One is the international consensus on two states. The second option is Israel continues doing exactly what it is doing now with U.S. support. Israel doesn't want to take over the Palestinian population. In fact, what they're doing, it's right before your eyes. They're carrying out settlement and development programs which carve up the West Bank. Gaza is kept as a prison. Carve up the West Bank in a way which integrates into Israel the parts of the West Bank that they want. The pleasant suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, the Jordan Valley where they're kicking out Palestinians, the corridors that go through to the east, Mala Adumim in the south, Ariel in the north, break up the region into sort of cantons, and take over the major resources, including water, but leave out the population. It's designed so that they will not, there will be very few Palestinians in the regions that are integrated into Israel, ultimately be annexed to it. So in fact, there won't be what's called the famous demographic problem. Too many Arabs in a Jewish state. It's not going to happen. What will happen, in fact, is that the proportion of Jews in greater Israel will go up when they bring in the settlers, because first of all, there aren't a lot of Palestinians in those areas, and the ones who are there are being kicked out. That's the second option. So if you don't have a two-state solution, this is what's going to happen, as long as the U.S. and Britain support it, of course.
Yeah.
That's crucial. Yeah.
Fantastic. I mean, already a lot of people have caught my eye. And I do deploy a geographic, gendered, youth ageist approach to cues. You have to stand up. This gentleman caught my eye about 2 hours ago. He's been in a camp bed since yesterday. But I'm looking at the back for the lady. Is that a lady? I'm applying a gender test. Very good. So this gentleman in blue, I'm afraid, and then the lady in the middle. You have to wait for the microphone. You have to stand up. You have to give us your name, and you have to be incredibly succinct.
James Thacker. I was at the Cooper Union with you 2 weeks ago and couldn't ask the question. I'm a novelist. I've worked since the Tet Offensive in this country with 7 human rights groups on almost all the issues you mentioned. I deplore and was alarmed to see Gary Will's comment just after Obama was elected that given the War Powers Act in 41, the military we have in 120 countries, the 1.2 million top security cleared spooks in the Washington area, if Obama had 36 years, he couldn't dismember this. Do you feel, as an American, that our Constitution and our government is beyond recall? Do you think there's any way that we can actually get back to what the Founding Fathers intended?
I'm going to take a couple, if I want. Thank you, James. That's a model, actually. Slight comment, question. Sir, you're going to emulate that skill at concision? And there's a lady who's going to have a microphone, whichever lady, yes, that lady whose hand is up in the foreground. Yes, sir.
Right, my name is Mike Harvey. Very simple question. Can you envisage anything changing America's supportive policy towards Israel?
Thank you very much. There's one more to come on this wave. Madam, have you got the way you go?
Yelena Balbekova, Master of Public Administration at London School of Economics. In 2010, in your interview to Democracy Now!, you supported a statement expressed by then in Financial Times that the major problem of foreign policy of Obama's administration back then was Iran. Do you think it shifted nowadays to Russia due to the failure to rein in its imperialistic ambitions, or it's too simple to narrow down it just to one country? Thank you.
Okay, did you get those three? This is, can I sub it down and you tell me if I'm wrong? Basically, Iran was the big deal in 2010, you said, a major policy challenge for America, the United States, and now it's shifted to Russia, Would that be about a fair summary of it? So that's that one, and you heard the other two, I think.
Yeah.
But
Well, let's take the last. Actually, 2010 was an interesting year in U.S.-Iranian relations. As you may recall, that was the year, I think, in which a deal was reached between Brazil, Turkey, and Iran, which would have pretty much settled whatever the issue was supposed to be. The basic principles of the deal were that Iran would ship its low-enriched uranium out of the country to presumably to be kept in Turkey, and in return, the West would provide medical isotopes for the Iranian research reactors. As soon as that deal was reached, it was bitterly condemned by the White House and reflexively by the press. I don't know what happened here, you tell me. The Brazilian government was pretty irritated by that. The foreign minister, Amorim, released a letter from President Obama to President Lula in which Obama had proposed this, presumably because he assumed that Iran would turn it down and they'd get a propaganda point. When Iran accepted it, they denounced it. It was pretty much ignored in the United States. There's all kind of pretexts for why they had to turn it down, but what happened is interesting. Iran remains, we may ask why Iran is regarded as, the way they put it, the greatest threat to world peace. The president, the Congress, the press regularly describes Iran this way. Incidentally, it's not the way the world perceives it. There was an interesting international poll that came out in December, run by leading U.S. British polling agencies. It was reported in BBC. I don't think it was reported in the United States. The poll, among other questions, asked which country is the greatest threat to world peace. The United States was so far in the lead, nobody was even close. Second, way behind, was Pakistan, and that was probably mostly because of the Indian vote. But Iran was way down. But in the United States, much of Britain too, much of the West, Iran is the greatest threat to world peace. We may ask why. Why is Iran the greatest threat to world peace? Well, there's an authoritative answer to that. It's the U.S. intelligence agencies and the Pentagon give an annual report to Congress on the global security situation. It's public. It's not classified. It doesn't get reported, but you can find it on the internet. And they explain, of course, they have a section on Iran, and they explain why it's a threat. What they point out is that Iran is not a military threat. It has very low military expenditures, even by the standards of the region, let alone the U.S. Its strategic doctrines are defensive, designed to deter an attack long enough for diplomacy to set in. That's its strategic doctrines. Then they say, well, if Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and of course U.S. intelligence doesn't know, they say that would be part of their deterrence strategy. That's quite significant. Aggressive states like the U.S., Britain, Israel cannot tolerate a deterrence strategy. It's too dangerous. You have to be free to use military force whenever you want. And it's true that Iran would be a deterrent if it had. They also accuse Iran of terrorism. Terrorism means support for forces that the U.S. doesn't like. So Iran supports Hamas, supports Hezbollah. We could discuss exactly what they are. But
let's get on to the other two, because I want to
okay.
go around. A woman has caught my
but
eye here, and a younger guy has caught my eye there.
That remains a problem. Going back to your quickly,
this is
can
an
we
important
change?
One, and Israel.
You brought the situation up, the fact that the U.S. has about 1,000 military bases around the world. They're rapidly extending this, incidentally, particularly in Africa. AFRICOM, the Africa Force is greatly expanding, putting bases all over the place. No other country has anything remotely like this. This is unique to the United States. and it's part of a whole system of global control. Can it be changed? Very easily. Go back to Orwell. I mean, if people in the United States and secondarily England, which is significant in this respect, if they sit passively and quietly and docilely and intimidated and accept what's going on, then it can't be changed. But we have enormous options. Of course we can change it. I mean, the British Parliament, for example, voted to block a strike against Syria. Well, that pretty much compelled the United States to go along. It's just one indication of what can be done across the board. So sure, we can change it. But not if we sit quietly and passively and say, well, let's blame the enemy, but not look at ourselves. Then nothing will change. This is well understood by leading American scholars. So, for example, the professor of the science of government at Harvard, I love that title, the science of government at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, who was a leading figure.
Civilizations guy.
Right, but he pointed out, interestingly, in 1981, a significant year, he pointed out that, he said, the state authority, the United States government, has to impose a system of force which is felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it's in the dark, when it's hit by sunlight, it evaporates. Mm-hmm. And then he expanded on that. This is 1981. He said, when the United States engages in military or other intervention in the world, we must create the misimpression that it's the Russians we're fighting. That way we intimidate the population into passivity. And of course it was a misimpression. Could go on with 1981. But his point is accurate. If people will remain intimidated and passive, then there's no way to change it. And this applies to Israel too. U.S. policies towards Israel are not graven in stone. And in fact, interesting developments are taking place in the United States. I've been writing and speaking about this for 50 years. I literally used to have police protection when I gave a talk on it, even at my own university, literally, MIT. If I gave a talk on this topic, the Cambridge and MIT police would be there. They'd insist on taking me back to my car and so on, all over the country. And now it has radically changed. It's one of the leading topics on campus. Thousands of people show up for talks. You can't get a hostile question, literally. That's part of a change that's taking place among the population. Will it affect policy? That's up to us. It can change. It's by now there's no time to talk about this. I mean, I'm glad to do it if you want, but I think you can easily show that for the last 35 years, the barrier to a diplomatic settlement has been in Washington and its allies. And that continues today, and that can change.
Okay, well, I'll pull in there. You may want to come back to it. I'm moving on the aisles. There's a lady, you caught my eye earlier, down there, woman, excuse me, over there somewhere. There's a younger man whose hand was up. There, was it you? Yeah, it's the chap with the hand up now. And Stephanie, are we getting ready for a tweet interlude? Where are we? Where are you gone? And we'll take one from you, these three, and we'll try and rattle through them.
Okay.
Do you want a glass of water?
No, I'm fine.
You've got the microphone. Name, stand up, and concise.
Okay, concise. Hi, my name is Denise Rudich. I'm a member of Chatham House. The U.S. is known as having a very strong unilateral sanctions regime. Can you maybe speak and give us your thoughts on the use of sanctions to advance foreign policy objectives and impose extraterritoriality, effectively? And do you think that the U.S. will be able to continue using these unilateral sanctions in the long run to have an impact globally?
Okay. You mean kind of smart sanctions, Denise, against individuals or
financial
companies?
And economic sanctions.
Financial and economic sanctions against, we're trying to...
Russia,
the latest,
Cuba,
whatever it is, Cuba,
Iran,
the UN, stuff like that. Brilliant. Thank you. Sir.
Thank you, John Argyle, member of Chatham House. Professor Chomsky, I'm just wondering your 1967 essay in the New York Review of Books on the responsibilities of intellectuals. Has anything significantly changed since he wrote that essay? How has the role of the intellectual in public discourse changed, and to what degree has it become more influential or less, in your opinion? Thank you.
Okay. The role of the intellectual, has it changed since 1967? You recall that article, and you'll need to update it briefly. But you've got a minute, because Stephanie's going to come in. Stephanie, how are we looking? It's like the Eurovision Song Contest on the tweet barometer.
Okay, so I've got a Twitter-based question. Chomsky says domestic population is enemy of state. In other forums, he said social media atomizes society. Should I delete Twitter? I have another one. Should Bush and Blair face trial for their conduct of the Iraq War?
Okay, thank you. And these are from...
I couldn't get those. You have to repeat them to me.
I would have difficulty repeating the first. It's sort of, should we abolish social media, Stephanie? Is that more or less it?
Basically, yeah.
I've subbed these down with great vulgarity. And the other is, should we impeach Blair and Bush? Should there be legal processes to establish retribution, legal retribution for actions?
Well, I don't regard that as retribution, but just punishment for crimes.
Yeah.
I mean, the worst crime of the 21st century has been the Bush-Blair invasion of Iraq. Totally without any credible pretext. If you notice, the pretext kept changing every time the facts changed. It's a textbook example of aggression, supreme international crime under international law, differing from other war crimes in that it includes all of the evil that follows. That's the Nuremberg judgment on. And you'll recall perhaps that Robert Jackson, the U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, warned the tribunal that, as he put it, we're giving these defendants a poisoned chalice, and if we sip from it, we must be treated the same way, or else the Nuremberg tribunal is a farce, victor's justice. So sure, they should be subjected to international law. Now, in the United States, that can't happen, because the United States uniquely is self-immunized against law. When the United States supported the International Court of Justice and practically initiated it in 1946, they added a proviso that the U.S. cannot be charged with violation of international treaties. They meant specifically the UN Charter, which bans the use of force, or the OAS Charter. That's been accepted by the courts. In fact, if you look at the record, just about, the U.S. rarely ratifies any international agreements, but when it does, there's almost invariably a reservation which says what's called non-self-executing. Technically, that means it doesn't apply to us unless there's specific legislation. And that's accepted by the courts. Like, for example, when Yugoslavia brought up charges against NATO, the U.S. Appealed to the court and said, we can't be charged. And the reason was that they had mentioned the word genocide. And when the U.S. signed the Genocide Convention, ratified it 40 years later, there was a reservation saying inapplicable to the United States. So this is across the board. The U.S. is immune, self-immunized to international law. Britain, not quite that much. But these are really things that are in the hands of the public. Again, if we permit our leaders to be major war criminals, sure, that's what they'll do. Power tries to achieve whatever it can. And if its domestic enemy allows it to do it, they'll do it. Snowden case is a case in point.
Sanctions, maybe quickly, but sanctions.
Well, I think, as in many of these cases, we should try to look at it from another point of view. Imagine that Iran or Cuba had the power to impose sanctions on the United States. Should they do it? They certainly have plenty of justification for it. I mean, I've mentioned a couple of cases. Should they do it? Well, you know, I wouldn't. I don't think that's the way they should deal with these problems. I don't think it's the way we should. We are much more culpable. I mean, we're the ones who are carrying out attacks on them. I mean, take, say, Iran. The United States, in 1953, the United States overthrew the parliamentary regime in Iran, imposed a harsh dictatorship. From that day until today, there has literally not been a day in which the U.S. has not been punishing Iran. Supported the Shah, harsh dictatorship up till 79, immediately turned to supporting Iraq's attack on Iran, which was murderous and brutal. The U.S. supported it all the way through with such enthusiasm that it denied the attacks on the Kurds, pretended that Iran had done them. As soon as the war was over, the U.S., this is the Bush administration, invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. Another threat against Iran. Immediately, sanctions were imposed on Iran. And then we come up to the present. This goes on. Literally not a day in which Iran has not been subjected to pretty harsh punishment by the United States. Should they impose sanctions on us, assuming that it was conceivable? Well, you decide. And I think that gives the answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. John's was about the intellectual, 1967.
Well, intellectuals is an interesting concept. I don't want to go on for too long, but the word intellectual in Western languages, in the current sense, it really comes pretty much from the Dreyfus trial. Before that, there were people, intellectuals, but it wasn't a category of dissidents. At the Dreyfus trial, you had dissident intellectuals, Emile Zola, the Dreyfusards, and so on. But take a close look. They were a small minority, and they were persecuted. Zola had to flee the country. The mainstream intellectuals, the immortals of the Académie Française and so on, they strongly supported the state and condemned the Dreyfusards for daring to criticize the majesty of the army and the state and so on. That's typical. There's very rarely an exception to that through history. Way back to periods, you take, say, the Bible. There were people in the Bible who were pretty much what we call intellectuals, people who condemned the king for criminal acts, gave geopolitical analysis, charging them with threatening the population, calling for mercy for widows and orphans and so on. We call them prophets. They had nothing, that's just a bad translation of an obscure Hebrew word. They were what we would call dissident intellectuals. How were they treated? They were imprisoned. They were driven into the desert, and persecuted, and denounced. There were intellectuals who were honored, the flatterers at the court. Hundreds of years later, they were called false prophets, not at the time. That continues right to the present. The term dissident in the United States and England refers specifically to critical intellectuals in enemy states, right? We don't call critical intellectuals in our client states dissidents, even though they're treated much more harshly than they were in Eastern Europe. So, for example, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the High Command of the Salvadoran government's U.S. client, close contact with the U.S. Embassy, ordered a brigade, the Atacadal Brigade, to invade the university and murder 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, one among leading Latin American intellectuals, happened to be Jesuit priests. They did. They blew their brains out. Do we call them dissidents? Does anybody even know about it? Can you mention their names? Just imagine that this had happened in Czechoslovakia or something. Probably had a nuclear war. But it happened in U.S. domain, so it just didn't happen. And this, I can go on with this, but if you take a look generally, the people who we call intellectuals, people with a funny category, but people who are sufficiently privileged and have sufficient resources so that they can speak about, articulately about issues of public significance, roughly what intellectuals are. Overwhelmingly, they're supportive of power, state and private power, absolutely overwhelming. there's usually, in every country, some fringe of critical intellectuals. If they're in enemy states, we honor them. If they're in our own client states, we blow their brains out and forget about it. But that's pretty much the way it's been through history. Okay. There's a few exceptions, few and very interesting ones.
Right, which we can think about later, but I'm determined to get another round in. Okay. Can we stay another 5 minutes? Do you mind?
Sure.
I've got four, sorry, I've got four. I've got this gentleman here, I've got this lady here, I've got the gentleman, yes, whose hand, put it up higher so I know it's you, not you, sadly. You, yes, you, put your hand up, yeah, you, yeah. And then this lady here. But these have to be ridiculously succinct, almost to the point of merely your name. Yeah. Sir.
Ronan Tynan, it's just on the question of human rights. I agree with you, the United Kingdom played a major role in stopping the kind of intervention in Syria which would have been wrong. But unfortunately, some people seem to think the problem was solved. An egregious human rights violation of Assad's barrel bombing campaign. I mean, it's grotesque what's happening. And the root of the problem, I put it to you, and it's where the elite universities in particular have been a disgrace, is the issue of human rights, as you outlined, as usual, in very eloquent terms. The egregious nature, certainly against the spirit of the US Constitution. What I'm really saying is the United States has given dictators plenty of opportunity to continue campaigns of brutality against their own people. And surely, for people who are interested in progressive causes,
that's called a leading question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
In the law. Ronan.
We don't spend enough time thinking about human rights.
I think it's a statement, we can come back to it, about human rights and the success of the change.
The United States,
No, microphone. No. This is a disaster for the chairman.
No, I apologise. I do apologise.
No, it's a disaster, a co-national.
In 8 words. Because the United States has chosen a pattern of the war on terror that violates everything the United States Constitution is supposed to stand for, it has given comfort to dictators everywhere to violate human rights. And we see that the results everywhere. And really...
Thank you. Thank you. That is laughter of appreciation. It's it's a comment. You can take it off. I want to get this lady in.
The United States has given support for dictators to violate human rights by the war on terror.
Yeah.
Oh, that's exactly correct.
It's a statement. It's a statement. God, Ronan, that was hard. That was hard work. Over to this lady who will now be succinct.
Hi, I'm Sue Nayung-Farnborough. I'm a member of Chatham House. Quick question regarding recent Japan's move towards the rather right-wing the political. Well, they are clearly manifesting their view, and particularly in the wake of their attempt to amend their Pacific Constitution. Meanwhile, they're refusing to acknowledge their military past regarding their neighboring country.
Right, so the question
is... So what's your view on that?
Article 9?
Article 9?
Yes, and also the Obamas now seems to be backing up.
Okay, so you got that one. And this woman here, and then there's a chap, it's you. Yeah, have you got a microphone? Yeah. Where you go? Name?
Hi there, I'm Polly. I'm a reporter for RT in London. And
RTE, Irish?
RT, no, Russia Today television.
Right, okay.
And I wanted to ask how you see we get it a lot, actually. So.
I know. I was just after the performance. I
wanted to ask how you see the conflict in Crimea playing out both in the short term and in the long term, the conflict in and over Ukraine. And whether that's changed the balance of power, or whether there's anything to say about the balance of power.
Does Crimea change the balance of power?
Yeah, that's a quite specific one. And, sir, no, it was actually the man right in front of you, I'm afraid. Yeah, I'm really sorry, but he had it much earlier. But you're enormously kind to give it up so quickly. Sir.
Koji Yamamoto at King's College London. Just your comment on 2 risks, I think, which have been underlying throughout the talk. One is the supporter of repressive government, in a way, jumping on your bandwagon and joining your criticism of the United States. How do we prevent that? The other one is a discount of you as someone of more of an idealist rather than realist. How do you think we can prevent these risks, in addition to our individual conscience, or our aspiration to follow your inspirational example? So this is a question of how do we go through or disseminate your view in addition to individual enlightenment?
Right. Okay, thank you. 2 questions, not one. Well, let's take the first one we did, actually, about China and so on. Are you an idealist? Am I saying marginalized because an idealist? Oh, there's Noam Chomsky, isn't he marvelous? He keeps us all in good form. But he's a fantasist, a moral fantasist. Would that be more or less? That's that one.
Would you say the same about Ai Weiwei, Shirin Ebadi, Václav Havel, Martin Luther King, people who've tried in their own countries to move towards greater freedom and justice? Yeah, they're idealists. I mean, they're trying to achieve something that's appropriate, and in other states we honor them for it, not in our own, of course. And it's the same. Ai Weiwei is not honored in China, only in the United States, and that's natural and understandable, and it shouldn't happen, but we should be aware of it. But I don't. We should apply. I mean, we simply have to apply to ourselves the standards we apply to others.
Yeah.
That's a pretty elementary moral principle.
Yeah.
Pretty hard, easy to say, hard to live up to, but very valuable. Yeah.
Polly, I think it was the strategic balance. Crimea changing the strategic balance. Question mark.
Not in any significant way. I mean, Crimea was in the Russians'. Look, it was part of the Soviet Union. In 1954, without asking the population, Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, handed it over to Ukraine. Every reason to believe that the population didn't want this. As I said, there had been a referendum in 1991, which came out pretty much the same as the recent one. They didn't want to be part of the Ukraine. But they were just handed over for Russian state reasons. And it's Russia has its major naval base, warm water naval base in Sevastopol. Generally it's been part of the Russian, kind of the general Russian system. The takeover of Crimea by force, as I mentioned, is a criminal act, one of many. I mentioned one worse one, but there are plenty of others. And yes, we should not be in favor of criminal acts. But in terms of the strategic balance, it amounts to essentially nothing. If you take a look, the United States has what are called red lines, lines you can't cross. If you cross those, there's a threat of war. Just take a look at where those red lines are. They're at the borders of other states. So one of the red lines is at the border of Russia. Another red line is at the border of China. There's a conflict developing in the Pacific, not in the eastern Pacific. It's not off the coast of San Francisco. There's a conflict developing in the waters off the coast of China, where China is attempting, you can argue whether it's right or wrong, to gain control over its major trading routes, the waters off its coast, which Japan had pretty much taken over in the course of imperial conquests. I mean, Japan has claims vast areas of the Pacific because of its imperial conquests. China, this was its century of humiliation. They don't have them. They're trying to get some of them back. You can like it, you can dislike it, but that's where the red line is. And that's the way it's been all the time. I mean, it's very interesting to look at the way American foreign policy is described, the way we describe it. So there's a lot of talk about American decline. What's rarely noticed is that this decline began in 1945. In 1945, the U.S. had overwhelming power. I mean, there was nothing like it in history. Security, wealth, and of course planned to use it to organize the world system. It began to decline very quickly. There's an event in the West called the loss of China, 1949. The loss of China took place. Big attack on big step in American decline. I can't lose your cell phone. I could lose my cell phone. In fact, I do it all the time. But I can't lose yours, right? How could we lose China? Well, there's only one way, if we own it. And that's taken for granted. The loss of China is a huge issue in American domestic policy. You know, who was responsible for the loss of China? They have to go after them, you know, McCarthyism and so on. When Kennedy escalated the war in Vietnam, we know from internal records, a lot of the concern was that he might be blamed for the loss of Indochina. How do you lose Indochina, you know? And it's the same all over. There's a premise in the United States, accepted in British elite circles, that the U.S. owns the world. And Britain is it's supposedly its partner. Actually, there's an interesting comment on the partnership right at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Britain's existence was at stake, literally, could have been wiped out by U.S. decisions. The U.S. was refusing to provide information to Britain. Macmillan was trying to get British intelligence to figure out what was going on. And there was a discussion in high-level circles about what was called the special relationship between the U.S. and Britain. And one high official, probably Dean Acheson, said, define the special relationship. He said, Britain is our lieutenant. The fashionable word is partner. In Britain, they like to hear the fashionable word, but the big guys use the word that counts. Yeah. So this is the U.S. attitude. Britain is a lieutenant, goes along, and it's a conception of world order that's pretty striking if you think about it.
We're nearly out of time now. Have we dealt with Article 9, or do you want to? Yeah.
The Article 9.
Yeah.
Well,
it's quite precise. So, yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's
in a sentence nearly.
You know, Japan now happens to be in the hands of a very kind of an ultra-nationalist government prime minister who is clearly trying to whittle away at Article 9. In fact, the pacifist article in the Constitution. I think it's a very bad thing. I mean, people in Asia have some memories of Japanese imperialism. There's also, for a long time in Japan, there's been kind of an underplaying of Japanese crimes in Asia. So the Yanaga was one historian, dissident historian, who fought hard to try to get the Japanese textbooks to at least include the facts. And there was some progress. Now it's going back again, you know, like denying the Nanjing massacre, things like that. This incidentally was abetted by the United States. After the war, the United States simply took over Japan. There was supposed to be a Far Eastern Commission of all the countries that were involved in the war, but they were all kicked out. The U.S. ran it unilaterally. There was a peace treaty with Japan, San Francisco Peace Treaty, 1951. The peace treaty charged Japan with crimes. Take a look at it. The crimes began on December 7th, 1941. There were 10 years of horrendous crimes before that, but they didn't count because they were crimes against Asians, what George Orwell called unpeople. December 7th, 1941 was different. That was against people. The structure of the peace treaty was so outrageous that independent Asian countries simply refused to attend. Like India wouldn't attend. Ceylon attended because it was a British colony. Philippines attended. They had to. But any independent Asians refused. Well, okay, that sets the basis. In fact, you know, this famous reverse course in Japan in 1947, the U.S. essentially restored the traditional order and undermined the democratic elements in society. And that helps, that lays the basis in which Japan has been able to maintain these policies. And I think it's a pretty bad thing. It doesn't mean we should, praise China for what it's doing. A lot of what it's doing is, I think, pretty outrageous, like with regard to Vietnam, but that's a different question. But as far as Japan's backing off on its pacifist constitution, I think that's extremely dangerous.
I think we're nearly there. We're nearly there. There's a question that occurs to me, might be even an unfair one. But sometimes when you listen to you here, you get the impression you began life fully formed with the clarity of vision. I mean, it's amazing, and a consistency. And I want to ask you, you don't have to answer, Fifth Amendment. But do you think you've ever been wrong about an issue? You know, no, they're laughing. They're laughing nervously. It is not.
Oh, a lot of times.
It is not a coy route into subversion.
No, plenty of times. I can think of case after case. I mean, take the worst crime of the post-war era, post-World War era. I mean, the worst crime was the U.S. attack on Indochina. A really horrendous crime. It destroyed 3 countries. They may never recover. Millions of people killed. You know, vast devastation, chemical warfare to destroy crops, every atrocity you can think of. The time to have become opposed to that was 1950. I didn't. I didn't do anything in the 1950s. It was pretty clear what was going on. It wasn't until the early 60s when Kennedy sharply escalated the war that I started trying to talk a little bit about it, and not enough. And that was a bad mistake. And there are plenty of others like it.
Yeah, okay. Look, there's people waiting for him. I'm, at this point, I want to just plug Chatham House. You know, it's a fantastic venue. There are lots of events. I don't know any of them. But go on the website. You'll see them. There looks to be a camera down there, which means if you want to watch this and catch sight of yourself when they're looking for questions, but more to the point, revisit it. It'll be, I presume, on a web. Will it be on a web or the web? So you'll be able to see it again. Thank you for being a very disciplined audience. Ronan, I am sorry about giving you a hard time over that question. It's my, but it was a statement which Noam agreed with, so I think he answered every single one of them. It's a prodigious display, and it's also, if I may say so, a very entertaining one. I think my name is Conor Gearty. I work at LSE. I feel very lucky to have been able to chair this event. I wonder whether you might now want to join with me in showing your appreciation of Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thanks very much.
Well done. Well done. Very good.